George Harrison was never the one to raise his voice. Rarely did he lose his temper in interviews. Yet, within the Beatles, he carried a quiet bitterness, one that deepened over time. It wasn't loud. It wasn't public. But it was real, and it was personal. Beneath his meditative calm and spiritual pursuits lay a wound that never truly healed. He was the silent figure, standing in the shadows. In the early 1960s, George Harrison was just a teenager riding a school bus in Liverpool when he met Paul McCartney. They swapped chords, traded records, and bonded over a shared love of skiffle and rock and roll. McCartney was older, sharper, more assertive. George, quiet and impressionable, was drawn to Paul's confidence, and later to John Lennon's brilliance. When Harrison joined Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, in 1958, he was only 15. Lennon initially thought he was too young. It was McCartney who arranged a second audition, on a bus, where George impressed Lennon by flawlessly playing the lead guitar line from Ranchy. That moment opened the door to what would become the most legendary band in history. But from the very beginning, George Harrison was stepping into someone else's story. In the band's early years, Lennon and McCartney shaped the identity of the Beatles. They were the main songwriters, the visionaries. George followed quietly, watching, learning, and, for a time, content with that role. As the Beatles rose to worldwide fame, Harrison became known as the Quiet Beatle. The press romanticized his introversion, but his silence was more than a personality trait. It was the sign of a voice that was never fully heard. To those who knew him best, George Harrison's silence carried weight. Beneath his calm exterior was a man beginning to feel pushed aside, even stifled. He had melodies in his head, spiritual revelations shaping his outlook, but in the studio, his contributions were too often dismissed. Songs he suggested were brushed off. Guitar parts he crafted were questioned, picked apart, or simply ignored. Paul McCartney, in particular, ever the perfectionist, had a habit of taking control. Years later, George admitted, "He ruined me as a guitar player. Not out of spite, but from years of being quietly undermined." The Lennon-McCartney partnership wasn't just strong, it was a fortress within the band. George wasn't merely excluded, he was left trailing behind. As time went on, the quiet frustrations hardened into something sharper. What began as admiration slowly shifted into resentment. And it was Paul who became the focus of that anger, especially during the breaking points in the studio. By the time the Beatles started recording the White Album in 1968, George Harrison was no longer satisfied being the overlooked contributor. By then, he had matured as a songwriter, more confident, more ambitious. Yet the studio atmosphere had grown volatile. The balance of power had changed. Paul McCartney, relentless and meticulous, had assumed a kind of unofficial leadership. John Lennon, distracted by his relationship with Yoko Ono, drifted in and out, his presence becoming unpredictable. In the middle of it all, George struggled for space, determined to finally make his voice heard. By 1969, George Harrison had had enough of being sidelined. The Let It Be sessions in early January laid bare the fractures that had been forming within the band for years. Cameras were there to capture rehearsals, but what they recorded was not harmony, it was disintegration. One exchange, in particular, has since become infamous. Paul McCartney instructing Harrison on how to play his guitar part for two of us. George, weary of the dynamic, responded with words that cut deeper than they sounded. "I'll play whatever you want me to play. Or I won't play at all if that's what you want." It wasn't sarcasm. It wasn't defiance. It was surrender. A quiet acknowledgement that he was too tired to keep resisting, but equally unwilling to keep enduring. To outsiders, it may have seemed like a trivial spat. To those in the studio, it was the breaking point of years of creative suffocation. Engineer Glyn Johns, who witnessed the Let It Be sessions firsthand, later described the atmosphere as very unpleasant. The studio had become a war zone. On January 10, 1969, George finally walked away, temporarily quitting the band. What stung most was that Paul didn't fully grasp the weight of his actions. He wasn't malicious, but he was controlling. McCartney had a vision, and he expected everyone else to fall in line, even if it meant flattening their input along the way. George had reached the edge of his patience. When he returned a few days later under revised terms, he carried with him a determination to prove himself. Out of this came Something and Here Comes the Sun, songs that revealed the brilliance he could achieve when given the freedom to breathe. But the scars remained. The rift between George and Paul was no longer just tension, it had hardened into distance. Though Harrison rejoined the Beatles, a part of him had already moved beyond the group. When the Beatles dissolved in 1970, the split was more than the end of a band. For George Harrison, it was the collapse of a friendship that had once defined his youth. While the spotlight often lingered on the public clash between John Lennon and Paul McCartney, George Harrison was quietly severing his own emotional ties, particularly with Paul. To the world, there were polite interviews, staged smiles, and occasional reunions. But behind closed doors, Harrison was weighed down by the resentment he had carried for years. In 1971, he released All Things Must Pass, a sprawling solo album built largely from songs that had been overlooked or dismissed during his Beatles years. The record was both a critical and commercial triumph, a statement that George had always possessed the artistry to stand on his own. Among its tracks, Wah Wah stood out. Its sound was bright and energetic, but the lyrics carried an unmistakable sting. The song's title was more than just a play on effects. It symbolized the emotional noise, the constant frustration, and the creative suffocation George had endured. Many listeners took it as a thinly veiled attack on McCartney's domineering role in the Beatles' final years. And the bitterness didn't stop there. In 1973, Harrison released Sue Me, Sue You Blues, a song born out of the bitter legal aftermath of the band's breakup. Though it spoke broadly about the group's fractured state, the underlying message was hard to miss. Much of his anger was directed at Paul, who had taken the decisive step of filing the lawsuit to dissolve the Beatles' business partnership. The move might have been practical, even necessary, but to Harrison it felt like betrayal, an official reminder of just how far their bond had frayed. Even those closest to him noticed the tension. Pattie Boyd, Harrison's first wife, later recalled that George never truly warmed to Paul's personality. She described how he would return home from the studio fuming, exhausted from endless clashes, most of them with McCartney. They tolerated each other, she said, and little more. I don't think there was ever real love between them. Professionally, yes, they crossed paths again. In 1994, the surviving Beatles reunited for the Anthology project. But even then, the same patterns re-emerged. George still found Paul difficult to deal with. In private, he'd roll his eyes at McCartney's constant ideas. Paul, meanwhile, played the diplomat, admitting in interviews that, even after all those years, they still got under each other's skin. Time had passed, but the old wounds never truly closed. By the mid-1970s, George Harrison had already built a strong solo career. Yet the scars from his Beatles years, particularly those tied to Paul, were still raw. In a 1975 radio interview with Alan Freeman, George made a startling admission, one that peeled back the calm exterior he usually presented. I had no confidence in myself as a guitar player, having spent so many years with Paul. He ruined me as a guitar player. It was a devastating confession, softly spoken, but razor sharp. Coming from the man whose playing had shaped songs like Something and While My Guitar Gently Weeps, the statement revealed just how deeply those years of creative suppression had affected him. George wasn't accusing Paul of malice. What he meant was clear. Being constantly overshadowed, second-guessed, and micromanaged had drained him of belief in his own artistry. He had spent too much time bending to someone else's vision, and not enough time being allowed to express his own. That tension shaped not only his guitar work, but his entire outlook on collaboration. Around the same time, George admitted he would have gladly joined a band with John Lennon again, but not with Paul. Paul is a fine bass player, he said, but he's a bit overpowering at times. It wasn't meant as an insult. It was simply the truth of what it was like to create alongside someone whose perfectionism often spilled into control. For George, the conflict wasn't just about music. It was about space, respect, and the freedom to be heard. For George Harrison, it was about space, the chance to grow, to evolve. Inside the Beatles, that space was almost non-existent. And the weight of that truth stayed with him long after the crowd stopped cheering. If Paul McCartney had been the source of visible clashes, John Lennon was the deeper wound, the one that never quite healed. In the band's early days, George idolized John. Lennon was older, sharper, fearless. To George, he was more than just a colleague, he was a guide. Alongside McCartney, John had nudged him into songwriting, encouraged him to stretch his ideas, to take risks with words and structure. That closeness, however, would not last. As the years went on, Lennon turned inward, absorbed by his relationship with Yoko Ono. George, once part of John's inner circle, was slowly shut out. Where Paul's dominance in the studio left Harrison stifled, John's growing indifference left him wounded in a different way. Lennon dismissed George's interest in Indian music and spirituality with jokes and sarcasm. What George sought as a path to peace, John treated as a punchline. Harrison leaned deeper into meditation and Hindu philosophy, but from Lennon he received little more than smirks and eye rolls. The depth of that estrangement became clear in George's 1980 memoir, I, Me, Mine. Across more than 400 pages, Lennon was barely mentioned at all. Fans noticed, and it was no oversight. Silence, in this case, spoke louder than words. George later admitted that John could be a very difficult person, and that their final years together were often cold. When Lennon was murdered in December 1980, the shock left Harrison shaken. Yet even in his grief, his tribute wasn't drenched in nostalgia. Through his song All Those Years Ago, he honored John's memory while still acknowledging the fractures that had marked their relationship. In the years that followed, George spoke of Lennon with more gentleness. Age and distance had softened the anger, allowing reflection to take the place of bitterness. The love had been real, but so had the pain. George Harrison never denied John Lennon's brilliance, nor did he hide the complexity of their bond. But the emotional scar remained. Lennon had once been the man George followed without question, and later, the one who made him feel invisible. Wounds like that don't simply fade, even with the passing of time. By the late 1990s, Harrison had largely moved beyond the shadow of the Beatles, at least in public view. He was no longer the young guitarist struggling for a place on a record. He had become a respected solo artist, a quiet philanthropist, and a spiritual seeker. Yet beneath the surface calm, the residue of his Beatles years still lingered. George rarely spoke of the band unless pressed to. And when he did, his words were often dry, understated, edged with irony. He refused to romanticize the past. Instead, he told his truth, bluntly. Asked once if he missed being in the Beatles, George quipped, "Not with the others, no." A line that earned laughs, but also revealed how deep the fractures truly went. In 1994, he reunited with Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr for the Anthology project. To fans, it was a miracle, the surviving Beatles together again, working on unfinished Lennon demos like Free as a Bird and Real Love. On the surface, it looked like healing. Behind the scenes, however, the old patterns quickly resurfaced. George grew restless under Paul's familiar leadership. When asked how it felt to record with McCartney again, he dryly remarked, "It was like going back to school." Producer Jeff Lynne, who had worked closely with Harrison in the Traveling Wilburys, later recalled how George would roll his eyes whenever Paul slipped into his old controlling habits. Even Paul admitted it, "We got on each other's nerves. But we got through it." By then, however, George was facing a different battle. In 1997, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. Radiation treatment briefly brought remission, but the disease returned, spreading to his lungs and brain. In his final years, George Harrison withdrew from the spotlight, spending his days quietly with his wife Olivia and their son Donnie at Friar Park, the Victorian estate he had turned into a sanctuary in Henley-on-Thames. Illness may have weakened his body, but his wit stayed sharp. In 2001, during a Yahoo online chat, one of his last public appearances, someone asked, "Does Paul still annoy you?" George didn't give a direct answer. Instead, he quoted an old Victorian proverb, "Scan not a friend with a microscopic glass. You know his faults, then let his foibles pass." It was pure Harrison, philosophical, elegant, yet laced with just enough bite to make its point. As his condition worsened, old friends came to visit. Among them was Paul McCartney. The meeting was private, quiet, stripped of the old tensions. Later, Paul recalled how they simply sat together, holding hands, something they never would have done in their youth. "He was my baby brother," Paul said in 2008. "We joked, we talked about silly things. It was like we were dreaming." On November 29, 2001, George Harrison died in Los Angeles, surrounded by those he loved. His final words, according to Olivia, were just three: love one another. Yet even in death, the complexity of his relationships lingered. Paul mourned publicly, speaking warmly about George. But beneath the tributes lay an unspoken truth: the fractures between them had never fully healed. Forgiveness, if it came at all, was quiet, incomplete, perhaps only one-sided. George Harrison left behind a legacy of music, of spiritual searching, of quiet defiance. He had never been the loudest Beatle, but his silence carried weight. There had been admiration, affection, even love, but also bitterness that time could not erase. In the end, some wounds were too deep for reconciliation. So what do you think? Did George and Paul ever truly find peace before George's passing? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, remember to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more untold histories from the world of music.